Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Wednesday? Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehuda in South Carolina, Shandora in the Bronx, Paul in the Great Northwest, Sharon in New Jersey, Guy in Ohio, Tom in PA, Bella in Florida, Lucy in Minnesota, Lorraine in Texas, Belle in Texas, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Marjorie in Georgia, Chaim in Florida, Ilanit in Silver Spring. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 96 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 6, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2. And we're right at the bottom of 96a. We got a good head start on this page yesterday. An Amoraic dispute between sages of the Gemara period, Amoraim, or sages of that period. An Amoraic dispute was stated with regard to one who sells a barrel of wine to another. And following the sale, it turned to vinegar. So Rav said, if it soured during any of the first 3 days following the sale, it is presumed that it had already begun to sour in the domain of the seller, and he bears financial responsibility. From that point onward, after 3 days, it is presumed that the wine turned sour in the domain of the buyer, and it is his loss. Now we're on 96b. And Shmuel said, even if the wine sours shortly after the purchase, the seller does not bear responsibility, as the wine is agitated as it is carried upon the shoulders of its new owner, causing it to sour quickly. Rav Yosef ruled in an actual case in accordance with the opinion of Rav. Right, so if it's soured within the first 3 days, it is the liability of the seller, after that of the buyer. But he ruled in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel in a similar case. So Rav Yosef ruled in an actual case in accordance with the opinion of Rav in a case in which beer spoiled shortly after it was sold. And he ruled in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel, where it's always the buyer's issue because he might have agitated it and caused it to sour, in a case involving wine. And the law is in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel. Right? So what the buyer needs to do is to taste it while he's buying it. Right? After that, it's going to be his loss. The sages taught in a baraisa whether one drinks date beer or barley beer, or a beverage made from soaking pomace. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Pomace, P-O-M-A-C-E, pomace, from the production of wine in water, and this liquid is known as tamad. So one recites the blessing, shehakol, by whose word all things come to be. Right? This is the general blessing. Wine has its own blessing, and we talked about yesterday. Bread has its own blessing, but there's a catch-all blessing for foods, and this includes beer and spirits, where we would say prior to consuming it, blessed be the Lord, blessed be our Lord, you ruler of the universe. Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, right? Not to say the blessing as we're talking about it. By whose word everything comes into being. That is the catch-all blessing, and that's the one that's used for beer and spirits. The question here is, we know that if we're drinking wine, we would say the wine blessing. But what if we're talking about a beverage that's like wine, that's similar to wine, that's made from grapes, but isn't exactly like wine? So we talked about if you're drinking vinegar, even if the vinegar was once wine, now that it's vinegar, we would say shehakol and not brei pri hagefen, the blessing over wine. Now we've got this unusual product called pomice wine. So pomice means that you press the grapes, you created wine, you fermented it, etc., and then you removed the residue, right? The residue from the wine making process. And not surprisingly, this grape residue after wine was made from it, you could extract more beverage from it. And this is called the pomace, right? You could also do this from apple cider, any kind of fruit that's pressed and you make juice out of it. So, you pull out, maybe 98% of the juice that's possible, and a little bit is still contained in that residue. So then if you take that residue and you soak it in water for a long time, you'll make a wine-like beverage out of it. And the question is, are we going to say the wine blessing over it because it's similar enough to wine that it warrants the wine blessing? Or are we going to say shehakol because whatever this thing is, and it might be potable and some people might like it, but nevertheless, it's not wine. Right? So that's the question we're looking at here. So the sages said in the Baraisa, whether you're drinking date beer or barley beer, or this beverage made from soaking pomice from the production of wine in water, known as tamad, for these, one recites over them the blessing shehakol. Right, by whose word everything comes into being, the catch-all blessing. Acheirem say, who's acheirem? Very interesting word. It means others. Acheirem are others, and so that's why it's it's a plural word, and that's why we say acheirem say and not acheirem says. But acheirem actually is usually code for Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir got himself in a little bit of trouble with some of his fellow sages. And while Rabbi Meir's formulation of many Mishnayos, many Mishnas, is the most authoritative one, because he got himself in trouble, sort of political trouble, let's say. He maybe spoke when he shouldn't have spoken. He wasn't as political as he should have been. So he ended up having his name, his attribution removed from some of his rulings in the Talmud. And either they were left anonymous, or sometimes it says acheirem. So usually when it says acheirem, it means Rabbi Meir, but for some reason his name got removed. Okay, so acheirem say, over wine made from pomice that has the taste of wine, one recites the blessing who creates the fruit of the vine. In other words, it comes from grapes, it tastes like wine, so we're going to say the wine blessing. Rabba and Rab Yosef both say the law is not in accordance with the opinion of acheirem. So if it's pomice wine, it's not wine, and we don't say the wine blessing. Rava said, according to the opinions of everyone mentioned in the Baraisa, if one poured 3 jugs of water over grape pomice, and then, after removing the pomice, the volume of the resulting beverage came to 4 jugs, then the beverage is regarded as wine. So evidently, a quarter of the resulting beverage is from juice that was contained in the pomice. Right? The vintner didn't extract all that he could from the pomice, so there really was some grape juice, aka grape wine, left over in the pomice. And when we soak it in water, it comes out, and it's able to add, so that in the resulting mixture, it's 3 parts water and 1 part this pomice wine. Then we're going to say it is wine, and we're going to say the wine blessing. The Gemara interjects Rava's comments, and with this statement, Rava conforms to his standard line of reasoning. As Rava said, any wine that does not contain 3 parts water to 1 part pure wine is not regarded as wine, as it is excessively strong. Now, do we dilute our wine even 1-to-1 with water? Certainly not, let alone 3-to-1. I don't see anybody adding water to their wine these days. And that's because our wine is bottled and ready to drink in the sort of the format, let's say, that we are customarily that we are accustomed to. Wine tastes like wine. What comes in a bottle tastes like wine. It has an alcohol content, somewhere in there, 12 to 15%, and that's wine. It doesn't need to be watered down. But in Talmudic times, that's not how wine came. Wine came much stronger than that. It was not drinkable in the sort of form in which it is sold, and it needs to be diluted with water. And so when one prepares the cup of wine, prepares the cup of blessing, it doesn't just mean that he pours it, it means that he dilutes it, and it ends up being 3 parts water and 1 part wine, this kind of strong wine that they had in ancient times. Now, Rava continues. If one poured 3 jugs of water over pomace and the volume of the resulting beverage still came to 3 jugs, well, then it is nothing. It is not regarded as wine. It may be added a little color and flavor, but no juice came out of the pomace to join the water, and that's why we would not call this wine. When the Tanaim and the Baraisa disagree is in a case where one poured 3 jugs of water over pomace, and the volume of the resulting beverage came to 3.5 jugs. As the rabbis, meaning the first Tana in this ruling, hold that 3 jugs of water were absorbed into the pomace, and then the same 3 jugs of water seeped out of the pomace. Therefore, there remains half a jug of the resulting beverage that was originally pure wine contained in the pomace. But half a jug of pure wine mixed into 6 half jugs of water, right, because it's 3 full jugs plus a half jug, this is nothing, i.e. the mixture is too weak to be regarded as wine. It's not 1 part out of 4, it's 1 part out of 7. And acheirem, right, Rabbi Meir, hold that 3 jugs of water were absorbed into the pomace, but only 2.5 jugs of water seeped out of the pomace, as 1 jug of water was replaced by a jug of pure wine contained in the pomace, and therefore there remains 1 jug of the resulting beverage that is pure wine that was previously contained in the pomace, and 1 jug of pure wine mixed into 2.5 jugs of water. This would be regarded as full-fledged wine, and that's why acheirem we say the wine blessing, but we don't follow their ruling, or his ruling. The Gemara asks, and where the volume of the resulting beverage is greater than the amount of water that was poured over the pomace, do the sages ever disagree? But didn't we learn in the case of one who produces tamad, this beverage made by steeping grape pomace in water, and he placed a measured amount of water into a container together with the pomace, and after removing the pomace, he found that the volume of the tamad produced, the volume of the tamad produced was equivalent to the amount of water used. So one is exempt from the requirement to tithe the tamad, even though the pomace came from the grapes that had not been tithed. And Rabbi Yehuda deems one liable to tithe the tamad. And the Gemara explains the difficulty posed by this Mishna. It would appear that they disagree only with regard to a case where the volume of the tamad produced was equivalent to the amount of water used. But in a case where the volume of the tamad produced was greater than the amount of water used, they do not disagree. Rather, they all agree that it must be tithed because it is regarded as wine. And this would appear to contradict Rava's explanation. So as we were talking about yesterday, if you have a vineyard and you're growing grapes, and if you're growing the grapes to serve them as table grapes, right, just to eat them as grapes, okay, so then you tithe them before you start eating them. But if you're growing the grapes in order to produce wine, so you go through the wine making process, and then you tithe the wine, right? So from the finished wine, the first 2% of your production goes to a Kohen, that's Teruma, the next 10% to a Levite, that's Meiser, the next 10% after that, depending on the year, either it's second tithe, known as Meiser Sheni, to fund your pilgrimage to Jerusalem when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, or it's Meiser Ani, second tithe that is given to the poor. Now, what about where you have this pomace, right, that's residue from the fermenting process, and then you make more beverage out of it? Okay, so if it's the kind of beverage that's going to qualify as wine, and you're saying the wine blessing over it, so that's going to need to be tithed also. If it doesn't amount to wine, if it's really just something mixed with water, then maybe you don't need to tithe it. And that's what they're talking about here. You know, how wine-like does it have to be in order to require tithing? We're on page 97a now and getting a little bit of a head start on tomorrow's daf since today's was so short. The Gemara resolves the difficulty. Actually, the same is true in that they would disagree, even where the volume of the tamad, right, this wine-like beverage made from the pomice, that the tamad produced was greater than the amount of water used. And the reason that the Mishna records only that they disagree about a case where the volume of the tamad produced was equivalent to the amount of water used is in order to convey to you the far-reaching nature of the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that one is liable to tithe the tamad even in this case, right? You put in a gallon of water with this pomice, and you got out a gallon of the tamad. Okay, well, that's all water. It's absorbed some flavor from the pomice, but there's no wine that came out of the pomice. There's no liquid that came out of the pomice, at least according to the majority. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, well, actually, some of the water got absorbed into the pomice and some juice came out, and there was an exchange, and that's why we can say that this mixture is wine-like and requires actually is a version of wine, and therefore it requires tithing. And presumably he would say that if you drink it, you have to say Brei Pri Hagafen. Now Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak asked Rabbi Rav Chia bar Avin, if one steeps pomice and produces tamad that has the taste of wine, what is the blessing that one should recite before drinking it? And Rav Chia bar Avin said to him, do you hold that such a beverage is wine? It is merely a sharp flavored beverage, not wine. That's why you don't tithe it, and that's why you don't say the bracha for wine. New subject, the sages taught in a baraisa concerning the production of successive batches of tamad, of decreasing strength, by reusing the pomice after each time a tamad is produced. So with regard to the pomice of teruma wine, the first and second products are considered to be teruma, and it is prohibited for a non-priest to drink it. But with regard to the third product, a non-priest is permitted to drink it because this is not teruma. And Rabbi Meir says, even with regard to the third product, if the wine that seeps out of the pomice imparts the flavor of wine to the water, it is forbidden to a non-priest. The Brisa continues, and with regard to water added to pomice of second tithe wine, the first product is also considered to be second tithe, and it is prohibited to drink it outside Jerusalem because it's second tithe. You could sell it, and then it would be deconsecrated, and you'd have to use that money during your pilgrimage to Jerusalem. But if you're just going to consume it, it has to be consumed in Jerusalem like any Meiser Sheni, second tithe. And with regard to water added to pomice of wine that was consecrated to the temple, up to the third product is prohibited to derive any benefit from it because it's consecrated. But from the fourth product forward, it is permitted because this really bears nothing in common with wine or even the derivative of wine. At this point, it's just, barely the hint. It's like those seltzers that just have a hint of flavor, but no real juice has been added to it. And so even if it was consecrated, this product would not be. The fourth extraction. Rabbi Meir says, even with regard to the fourth product, if the wine that seeps out of the pomice imparts the flavor of wine to the water, it is prohibited. And the Gemara raises a contradiction from a different baraisa. Tamad produced from the pomice of wine that was consecrated to the temple is always forbidden, even after having steeped them many times. And the beverage produced from pomice of second tithe is always permitted, even from the first such product. So the Gemara explains, the ruling concerning consecrated pomice is difficult, as it's contradicted by the ruling of the first baraisa concerning consecrated pomice. And the ruling concerning second tithe pomice is difficult, as it is contradicted by the ruling of the first baraisa concerning second tithe pomice. We have very different outcomes for what's supposed to be the same principle. So the Gemara answers the contradiction between the ruling of one baraisa concerning consecrated pomice and the ruling of the other baraisa concerning consecrated pomice is not difficult, as one can explain that here the second baraisa is referring to pomice with inherent sanctity, and there the first baraisa is referring to pomice with sanctity that inheres in its value. Also, the contradiction between the ruling of one baraisa concerning pomice of second tithe and the ruling of the other baraisa concerning pomice of second tithe is not difficult, as one can explain that here the first baraisa is referring to pomice whose status as second tithe is certain, and there the second baraisa is referring to pomice of second tithe of demai, doubtfully tithed produce where it was bought from an amharitz, an ignorant person, and we're not sure whether he tithed it properly or not. Now, on this question of inherent sanctity, what is that? So the Rashbam and the Migash explain that wine with inherent sanctity is wine consecrated as a libation offering in the Holy Temple, and wine that with sanctity that inheres in its value, this is wine consecrated to the temple treasury. So other commentaries suggest that even when wine is consecrated as a libation, as long as it has not been placed in a temple service vessel in preparation for use as a libation, it is not invested with inherent sanctity. Rather, its sanctity continues to inhere only in its value, and that means that you could deconsecrate it by buying it back, as it were, and the money that was used, and then that money that you used to purchase it, that's a donation to the temple treasury, and then the wine could be drunk by somebody who is not a priest. That would be if the sanctity is in its value. If it's inherent sanctity, according to that first view, where if you've consecrated it to be used as a libation poured on the altar with the kinds of offerings that are accompanied by a wine libation, okay, so that wine cannot be deconsecrated and can only be used for its sacred purpose. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadak, in the same way in which the sages said, differing strengths of tamad, that with regard to their prohibition, after a certain number of times the tamad produced is not considered to be wine, so too they said the same rulings with regard to their capacity to render foods susceptible to ritual impurity. In other words, to render food susceptible to ritual impurity means tuma. And if you have, for example, a pile of harvested wheat grain, so even if a sheretz, a creeping thing that would impart, a dead creeping thing that would impart tuma, ritual impurity, fell onto that pile, it does not become tameh unless it has been rendered susceptible to impurity, to tuma. So what makes it susceptible to tuma is that it has come into contact with water or one of the other 6 liquids capable of rendering produce susceptible to tuma. And even if water fell on the pile, it has to fall in such a way that its owner would desire that it became moist in that way. In that case, that food is now sort of finished and ready for eating and therefore susceptible to tuma. If it hasn't come into any contact with that kind of a liquid, it's considered not yet finished food and therefore cannot become tameh. So what about this water that's mixed with other stuff that's tamad, might have wine in it, might not. Now, wine is one of those 7 liquids. This tamad, is it wine, is it not? Let's keep reading. So the Gemara asks, when the Baraisa is referring to their capacity to render other foods susceptible to tuma, why does it matter which kind of beverage the tamad is considered to be? Whether the tamad is regarded as water or not, or wine, still as water, it can render food susceptible to tuma. Or whether it is regarded as wine, it can render food susceptible to tuma. So what difference does it make how attenuated, this pomace has become as it's been soaked repeatedly to create tamad? And the Gemara clarifies, it is necessary to state this in a case in which one produced tamad with rainwater, because rainwater is not the same as water for the purposes of rendering food susceptible to tuma. So if the tamad was made with rainwater, it would only render other food susceptible to tuma if the tamad is considered wine. And as we've seen, even according to all opinions, once the tamad has, been weakened sufficiently, enough iterations of this pomace being turned into this beverage, so eventually you can't call it wine, and it would not render something susceptible to tuma. Now the Gemara challenges this. Maybe not all opinions, because it seems like Rabbi Meir is so stringent on this, but certainly by the majority. Now the Gemara challenges this, but since he took the rainwater and poured it into a container holding the grape pomace, he has thereby intended it for a use. We don't call it rainwater anymore once it has been used by a person for something specific. Even if the resulting tamad is regarded as water, such rainwater does render food susceptible to tuma. And the Gemara answers, no, it is still necessary to state this in a case where the pomace produced tamad by itself, having been steeped in water that happened to fall upon it. The Gemara persists because it wasn't done on purpose by a person with that intention. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara persists that the Baraisa above states that from the third product, right, the third soaking, the tamad is regarded as water, which the Gemara has explained is referring to rainwater that one did not intend to use and that consequently cannot render food susceptible to tuma. So the Gemara asks, but since he draws off each subsequent lot of tamad that is produced one by one, in order to allow more rainwater to fall into the pomace and produce more tamad, he thereby demonstrates his intent to use the rainwater. Therefore, even if the tamad is regarded as water, it should render food susceptible to tuma. And the Gemara answers, Rav Papa says that this is a case of a cow that drank the lots of tamad one by one, and some inadvertently dripped from the cow's mouth onto the food. Since no person intended to use the tamad, if it is regarded as water, it will not render food susceptible to tuma because it was never rainwater that was brought into someone's intention to use it for something. It remained rainwater. Only the cow, drained it off from when the rainwater fell on the pomace, and then it was 3 soakings. This is like complete hypothetical, testing our understanding of the principle here. It's not like this could ever happen in the real world, probably. But the point is, it would not render food susceptible to tuma as water, only as wine. So the question is it wine? And after the third such soaking, it seems like at least the majority agree that it is not wine. And therefore, you don't say hagefen on it, and it will not render produce susceptible to tuma. That's what I've got for us today. Just a few questions. How alcoholic was pomace, wine, or juice? I don't know. Sounds to me like a lot less than their very strong wine. But I just don't know, and I don't feel like there was a note about that unless I missed it. Let's just see what they wrote. So the Brisa is not referring to the grape pomace itself, which is not edible, but to a beverage that is created by steeping in water the pomace that remains after fermenting wine from grapes. Such pomace has absorbed some wine during production. Therefore, when it is steeped in water, some of the wine seeps out and mixes with the water, forming a beverage with the taste and odor of wine and even some alcohol. Okay, even some alcohol, certainly much less than what they were accustomed to in wine. So that answers that. Sharon says, I thought Acher was Rabbi Elisha ben Abuye. Acher is Elisha ben Abuye. And Rabbi Meir was not named at all because he retained his relationship with Elisha ben Abuye. Am I remembering incorrectly? Yes, a little bit. Acher is Elisha ben Abuye, the sage that went bad. Rabbi Meir is not named in a bunch of places. I don't think it's because he maintained his relationship with Elisha ben Abuye. It was more that I forget what the incident was, but he challenged, I think it was Rabban Gamliel, and about something, and it was about the authorship or the authority of certain Mishnayos. I can't remember what the issue was, but that's what I'm saying was sort of like a political issue within the world of the sages. And that's why his name was taken off a bunch of the Mishnayos that he actually formulated. And then we just see in a few places this term acheirem, not acher singular refers to Elisha ben Abuya, acheirem plural refers to Rabbi Meir. It doesn't come up that often, but when it does, it's referring to him. And Sharon, if you are growing wheat to make bread, do you tithe the wheat, the bread, both? I believe you tithe the wheat. Yeah. So I guess the question there is, do you tithe it when it's flour, or do you tithe it, when you're selling it as a raw product? And that's a great question, and I feel like I should know, and I don't know the answer to that. I'm thinking it's gone through some processing. I'm not sure if it's gone to the stage of grinding it into flour, but certainly the winnowing and removing the chaff, etc., that has happened. And I think you would tithe it at that stage because people will then decide how fine they want to grind it into flour, but I'm not sure. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday. So really, God willing, at the regular time. I have a late appointment tomorrow afternoon that may necessitate starting a little bit late. If that's going to happen, I'll put an announcement on the Facebook page, so you might want to check the Accidental Talmudist Facebook page late in the afternoon tomorrow. I'm anticipating that won't happen. I'll be able to make it on time, but if there's an issue, I'll post it there. Have a great night.